we can identify multiple changes to be made in the environment that speak directly to some specific genetics in an individual, we can produce profound results.
Welcome to Longevity FM, where we as industry insiders talk to leading experts and enthusiasts in the field, sharing exclusive insights and helping you separate proven science from all the nonsense. I'm your host, Dr. Rob Connaught from Switzerland, and remember, it's your health, it's your life, so take control. And now, enjoy today's episode.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of Longevity FM, for which I had the honor and privilege talking to James Raaff. James is a clinician and translational genomics expert from Cape Town, South Africa. And for over 25 years, he's been working with everyone from everyday Joe and Jane to high performance people, athletes, Olympic medalists. And what I really like about James is a very integrative approach to healthcare, which is purely based on science. And of course, genomics play a crucial role in that. While genes probably only account for 20% of who we are and what we are, and the other 80% is epigenetics, so how these genes that we have express through our lifestyle, through what we eat, through how we exercise and sleep and everything else, they in a way give us a blueprint of how to approach our long-term health and how to approach our longevity. Because essentially, your genomic predisposition will show you the low-hanging fruits of what you should actually work on when it comes to health and when it comes to staying healthy for as long as possible. So it's been a fascinating conversation. We're touching on a lot of topics. For example, why genomics isn't a topic which is more widely accepted by traditional healthcare practitioners, how you can actually create changes in your life, and what role micro changes play in behavioral change. The episode was shot on the beautiful Spear Farm in Stellenbosch, South Africa. So I want to say a big thank you for Marietta and the owners of the Spear Farm. And if you can, visit it. And now, without further ado, let's get to the interview, and I'll see you after.
So maybe can we start a little bit by you explaining what it is that you do, your focus on genomics, a little bit about your work, and then we can dive into the more nitty-gritty of health and longevity.
Sure. I think my whole career has evolved and developed over 25 years based on trying to broaden my focus as much as possible around a client or a patient, to try to account for all the factors that might influence somebody's health and might influence their outcomes. I think what I rebelled against intuitively was the compartmentalization or narrow focus of this specialization nature of healthcare, which builds, I think, a form of confirmation bias. If you're only working in one area, you're confirming what you already know. And I suppose it's just a deep need to learn and inquisitiveness that has driven me to try to broaden. And in the more recent years, say the last decade, has been the rapid growth of the field of genomics. I've always been interested in the defining of a person's individual biochemistry through genetics. That's become clinically able to use for several years now, and then looking at matching all the various factors that are modifiable in a person's environment to produce the outcomes. And so it led me to some pretty intense and amazing learning opportunities in advanced translational genomics, which it sounds like a mouthful, but it really is about how can we translate that which is required to change in the environment into daily action for people. And what it's led me to realize is that if we can identify multiple changes to be made in the environment that speak directly to some specific genetics in an individual, we can produce profound results. As we've talked about a few times in the last weeks, it's a form of micro-optimization, making small changes in key areas that, when geared together, they produce the health shifts that we're looking to achieve with clients and patients.
And I think that's one of the most common misunderstandings that you encounter. That's, my genes are my genes, you cannot change them. So whatever I was given at birth, I need to live with, but it's exactly the opposite, right? So the genes only account for a very small amount of the expression that we have in our health and in our well-being and who we are. And the epigenetics, so what happens with these genes is actually what we can influence, what we should influence to live longer and healthier.
Absolutely. For now, that's true. I think there are technologies that are looking at gene editing, but I really can't see those becoming common use every day in an everyday clinical setting for quite a while. And you're 100% right that what the gene does is it gives us the range of changeability that might exist. And it is the change in the environment through the epigenome that produces a shift in gene expression. So I think that's the tricky part. It requires some education. But I think when people get it, immediately there's a shift on some intrinsic epigenetic level, like a new awareness. So I actually can control my future to a degree. And that's very exciting. It's motivating and it helps with compliance. And people realize that if they can sustain a certain change, they might really see some outcomes.
So what are these changes that people can make when you know about the genome and we know what their genetic predispositions are? What are things you can change?
Well, the complexity of the genome and environment means that there are literally thousands of things that can be changed. And I think the key to understanding why both data is required in the area of genetics and genomics is that understanding a person's genome based on the various genes that operate or control various pathways of physiology means that a comprehensive and broad genetics report in 2021 can produce a list of priorities or a list of genes and pathways that we'd say are termed high impact. In other words, an investment in change with regard to those genes is likely to create a large return in health investment. And so it's a form of, I suppose what that is a form of not triage, but identifying the priorities. Like where ought we to begin? If there are many things we could change, what should we start attempting to change?
So the low-hanging fruits of in the order of importance.
There's still a discussion that needs to be had with the individual about what they're prepared to entertain changing, and I think that's where the science of healthcare moves into an art of healthcare, and realizing that at a clinical level you're always dealing with people, and we as human beings, we are through an evolutionary stimulus creatures of habit. It has saved energy and it's got us this far, which is a long time on the planet. And I think that we still have to acknowledge that some people find behavior change challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm probably one of the best examples for that. I mean, it's like at the end of the day, you have to start with yourself. And I know how hard it can be to change your patterns and change things that you've been doing for many years and decades. But I think that's one of the things I found so fascinating in the conversations we had in the past few days and weeks about these micro changes that you can do. Because I think what people could be afraid of is that they get their analysis, and then there's this shopping list of things to change. And it seems so scary. Like, do I need to change my whole life? And do I need to turn my whole life around? Do I need to stop smoking, drinking, eating what I love to eat, change my diet, exercise, whatever? And that's scary. But the power really is in the tiny little changes you can do and easily integrate into your everyday life. And then you can add up and stack up those little changes to get to the point where you have a much better result, right?
Absolutely. So if somebody understands that making a small change to a habit might not do that much alone, but the so-called holy grail of human behavior change is making tiny changes on multiple levels. As I mentioned before, we can use genetics to determine which of those levels are high impact out of the sea of potential change, and then helping people understand that if it's not that difficult to make that habit change, it's likely to be sustainable, which is important. It speaks to compliance. And I think what is also important is that on a broader level, there is already a lot of science about how humans change behavior. You know, there were times where we thought all you need is enough motivation. So if you're threatened with your life or with a large sum of money, people often change.
Yeah.
But motivation only accounts for a part of human behavior change. You also need to know how to do it. You know, what is it that I have to change, and how do I have to make that change, and what might I require to make that change? And then finally, an aspect of coaching becomes valuable, because I think what a good coach does is throw in the right timing and the right cues or prompts, reminders to exercise something, a new habit of some form. And the science of human behavior change speaks to the right combination of all those things, of motivation, the ability to do it, and a cue to remember to do it. I think there's one final thing that comes from the literature of Professor B.J. Fogg at Stanford University, and that is that when you successfully make a behavior change, you remember to do it, that some form of celebration or reward, acknowledgement that you have done it right, is important.
Okay.
And a lot of people notice that we tend to be hard on ourselves, and we tend to wait until we've achieved a great deal before we celebrate. And that's a mistake. To chunk what you need to change, which may be large at the outset, into small little steps, and then reward yourself after each little step. Micro rewards, if you want.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's quite powerful. So we might as well utilize that information that exists in the field of human behavior change, in health behavior change.
So can you walk us through such a process? So how does it look like? Where do you start? Where do you begin with? What are the things that you look at in the beginning? Maybe even before you start doing the genetic testing. So walk us through it.
So we spoke earlier about casting the net wide, or going really broad. So in truth, in theory, everything matters. You know, everything that came before, in other words, a medical history, and a patient's or a client's story. You know, this requires a lot of listening, and it requires building enough trust and openness in the professional relationship for the client to open up and start telling you their story. So that speaks to I think a more effective way of gathering a history. Also, trying to find out what the person aspires to change, or what goals they have, is really important. And then gathering as much data as possible. Of course, what defines our uniqueness and allows us to become precise in terms of creating a strategy, a health strategy, is grounded in genetics. That's where we see the reason for the variation of function and variation of form and variation of everything in the animal kingdom. So there are multiple laboratories around the world, some better than others, some that produce really well thought through genetics reports, and that's always extremely valuable. So I tend to require that information before I can even begin understanding what strategy to create. You need a context in order to figure out a plan. So the most important context of any interaction between a clinician and somebody who wants to make a change in their health is some details about who they are. So the genetics is important. Ideally, we'd want some biomarkers. If you were, for example, wanting to change your body weight, you'd need to know, well, how much do you weigh right now? And then, of course, a little greater resolution as to what's behind that weight. So some biographical data, some biomarkers, which could go as deep as blood biomarkers and more. There's a lot of information that we can glean. And then I would sit and map out all those data points, or those pieces of information. And what would coalesce is a very personalized strategy that I could radically simplify for the first discussions with the client. So it's quite easy to overwhelm yourself and the client with everything that ought to be done. And I think that's where almost I liken it to a chess game. You might have a plan of how you're going to win this game, and you need to play a move at a time and have phases in your strategy. And that means delivering the right information at the right time to the patient in areas they're prepared to make change at that time. So I think it's for me, it's wonderfully exciting because it does yield great results. And of course, all people are looking for is a strategy that quickly begins to show them that it works. It's the ultimate motivator of success. And then it's important, I think, to have certain biomarkers that act as a quantitative guide as to the success of your progress. So somebody might start feeling great after a few weeks of working on a journey like this, a genomics journey. And it's valuable and important to me to be able to have some quantitative metrics of what have we actually done. Proof, so to speak, of change. Or some data to account for the way they feel. If that's changed, if something's improved, it's nice to know, have a slightly tighter hypothesis as to why that's occurred. Not let it be up to chance.
And how's your work changed in the last 3 years? What has changed in the last 5 years? And what do you think, where will the journey go? Where will it be in 5 years from now?
Well, I clearly remember, and I have the actual reports of the first genetics reports that we were able to use 7-8 years ago. And these presented between 5 and 10 SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that were deemed really critical in health outcomes. But clearly what it was a hideous underestimation and sample bias. So we realized that some of them were really valid, but complexed against the more resolution that came very quickly because the field is growing so fast. We were able to start making, I think, a more valid clinical decisions. And at the same time as the quality, resolution, size, and accuracy of the genetics reports has been an even faster growing area of all the omics, all the fields of genomics. So understanding how various components in nutrition affect gene expression, nutrigenomics, has grown massively fast. And that's a field that it's pretty intimidating to stay abreast with it. It requires a huge amount of constant reading and understanding. But fields like sleep genomics and relaxation genomics and how circadian rhythms affect the genome have only really been available for us to use in a clinical setting in the last couple of years. I think Nobel Prizes were won in that area very recently. And so for example, if you forgive me getting the date not entirely right, but pretty much at the beginning of 2017, we could say one or two things about the clock gene, circadian locomotor output cycles kaput gene that has a lot to do with day-night cycles and circadian rhythm. You could say a couple of pointers on it at the beginning of 2017, but there are literally books about it at the end of 2017. And there are few fields in applied science that are growing as fast. So that's really exciting. It's obviously also opened up a huge amount of interest in research fields in the area. So more and more information, more and more products are becoming available that are actually useful. I always like to think of it as worth it products. There's so many things out there that we could try, but some of them have been well researched and used these rapidly growing areas of genomics to be able to be simplified into something that is usable as an app or as a wearable device to really make it worth it. It's exciting.
And where's the intersection between traditional medicine and traditional, the things that you used to do 20 years ago, just looking at the patient, looking at one symptom and then treating a symptom, and this new field of medicine?
Well, the observation of the patient and listening to the patient will never be useless. It's very important. You know, I doubt that machines...
Squirrel's gonna eat the cable.
If it was a rat, it'd probably do it. Squirrels are smart.
Sorry for
no problems. Sitting down and listening to a patient with compassion or empathy and letting them know that you're really listening is an art, and I think that is going to be very difficult for machines to take over. But you know, the level of accuracy and information and resolution that's available to a clinician is amazing. I think that what we've learned and what we use in allopathic and biomedicine is always going to be valuable in acute infectious disease and trauma. But the problems that have really become huge in modern times are largely diseases of choice, chronic diseases that are about improper relationships with environment and people. And then those improper relationships or habits or patterns are sustained for decades. And so it's kind of logic that we're going to run into trouble if we're continuously making inappropriate choices for health outcomes. So I think what I've seen is, and felt and experienced, is most certainly a resistance initially from certain people in the sort of traditional field of biomedical care. But now I see an adoption of this resolution and the tools that I use into primary care. So I integrate my services a lot of time with specialists where I want to share the clinical responsibility and liabilities. So I work with an integrative psychiatrist, where we have some serious psychiatric disorders. It's not my specialty. I'm not trained in it, but the psychiatrist is very interested in what I can add to the broader background and clinical picture of a patient. And that really is amazingly valuable for the patient. So I like that. And in all fields, cardiometabolic disease, rheumatological, in oncology, massively so, there is more and more acceptance of integrative practitioners and the fields of genetics and genomics finding place. In my integrative team, which has been together for 17 years now, the other doctors are traditional school medicine trained doctors, and they're also trained in traditional Chinese medicine, holistic treatment therapies, and they specialize in integrative oncology. And so at least 70% of the patients that I've seen in the last decade have been complex and often advanced oncology cases.
Could you explain what integrative oncology means?
So essentially, any oncological case, the cancer is standard of care is surgery, chemotherapy, radiotherapy. And integrative oncology would say, surely there are other tools we can utilize. We might have to use some of those powerful Western techniques, and very often they save lives. But it shouldn't end there. And it should integrate into other areas that have power to shift and change biological function, physiological function, epigenetics, and genetic expression.
So we're talking about behavioral changes in diet,
Absolutely,
changes in exercise, changes in your environment. Okay.
So there was a time where oncologists would not be interested in any kind of dietary changes. They wouldn't say anything about it, or the use of exercise, or some kind of stress management. And now it's being more and more acknowledged because the research is pointing towards these factors as being causal in the development of neoplasms and of cancers. So I suppose it's a global trend that there is a broadening integration of healthcare practitioners around patients, which is great. Long time coming and very, very needed.
And how do you see the fact that in traditional medicine there's a trend towards even more specialization, hyper-specialization? Now we recently talked about if you talk about knee surgery, there are people specializing in just one specific tendon inside your knee, and they do nothing else but that. So how does that conflict with your approach, and how can these two different sides of the coin work together?
I don't think there's any conflict in that example. Particularly with the surgeons, the skill of a surgeon is most certainly going to improve the more times he works around the same tissues and develops tried and tested surgical techniques, but also sometimes has to come up with innovative ways of helping a person. A high degree of super specialization there I think is absolutely appropriate. The power of healthcare lies in early detection, and prevention definitely is better than cure in many cases. And when we look at chronic disease that takes time to develop, early detection techniques save trillions of dollars. So I think when you're talking about general care, primary care, family medicine, and looking to maintain health in the population, integration is required. And there will always be place for the rare occasions where the super specialization is required. It's important to be able to work broadly, but then it's also very important to have specialists that understand the detail in certain fields. And I think, again, that just speaks to greater degrees of collaboration, understanding who can do what.
Okay. And from your clinical experience, what percentage of diseases that you see could be prevented by lifestyle changes, by looking at these gene expressions that we have? So how much could be avoided looking at the bigger picture?
In the literature, a percentage somewhere in the region of 90-something, 95 to 98% chronic, and the rest being acute infectious has been, I've read, which is huge. I mean, even if we have an error of 10%, it's still huge.
Yeah, sure.
So, and of course, even when you're dealing with the rare conditions, proper genetic disorders, and end stage or advanced disease, there is always place to work in the background, to work on the broader background. Somebody who has had a surgery that may have been necessary or has gone through a terrible disease and come out the other end, it's always going to be valuable for them to learn about. They are making decisions all day, every day about sleep, about diet, about activity and exercise, and about how they manage stress. And also, we are all constantly listening to that voice in our head. So getting to understand the role that intrinsic patterns like awareness and your thinking patterns and emotional patterns and belief systems play in outcomes is gaining more and more appropriate or needed attention.
Okay. And if you were to order these things that you just mentioned, sleep, behavioral changes, diets, mental health in some sense, if you, as far as you can influence it, exercise, where are the biggest drivers? What's
It's also, I would say that if we have to talk generally, I would say that diet plays a large role, activity and exercise plays a huge role, sleep is critical in stress management. But the exciting part about what I do is that the priority or the large lever for each person is different. And that is revealed as I get to understand their genome. Very definitely, if one were to look at the Cochrane Library of Systematic Reviews in healthcare, the word exercise comes up as a modality for change nearly more than any other single modality. But that doesn't mean that exercise is the most powerful modality in every case. There is not going to be a likelihood of any human living a healthy life without an appropriate degree of activity. It's just one of those things that humans need. But I think I've thought about this once before by reverse engineering it and say, well, without what will we die the quickest?
Okay.
And that speaks to breathing and air quality, number one, because if you are prevented from breathing, you're not going to last long.
Sure.
Perhaps it speaks to air quality, and like we've seen cities, urban metropoli, develop real problems with air quality, and the sequelae or the results of that are catastrophic for the population living there. In a place like this, it's not going to be a problem.
Sure.
People can go 40 days without food on a hunger strike and survive. So clearly, diet plays an important role over a long period of time, but not as quickly. Getting adequate sunlight is pretty important, and most certainly sleep then becomes really interesting, because I don't know how long you've ever tried to stay awake for, but very few people will be sane after more than 3 nights or 3 days without sleep. Yeah. So, I mean, these are torture methods. It gives you an indication of how important they are. But I'd say that I understand your question, and I think that it will be different for each individual. And their genetics and where pathways of large numbers of genes require large support, we'll look to the most powerful genomic influence over those pathways to upregulate them or get them more balanced and firing properly. Some pathways respond beautifully to specific nutrition changes, dietary changes. Many respond to adequate sleep and reduction in stress powerfully, and most certainly many respond to exercise. Those are the key.
We're sitting near a nice river. What role does water play in fresh water?
Huge. You know, like if you talk about nutrigenomic influence, then water is most certainly the number one nutrient. So you can go many more days without quality food, but you can't go very long without water. And the quality of water across the planet has been degrading. So before one ran out to change diet or try to purchase supplementation of one nature or another, a really wise buy would be some sort of point of usage home water purification system. Make a huge difference to many people's lives, especially people who live in urban environments where governments and water boards and what have you would do their best to purify the water for us. But I think that sometimes what they do is just not enough. Certainly in South Africa, we have a large drought problem in many areas. And we've seen at different times in the year, the water quality fluctuate dramatically. So absolutely, water quality is key. Other roles water play is that immersion in water, super cold water, has been, it's coming up as an incredibly powerful trigger of ancient survival circuits in humans, and it's widely available in literature to utilize cold water immersion to trigger these things for health and longevity benefits, as is heat stress, probably more referring to saunas and steam baths rather than immersing yourself in hot water. But it plays a large role. As a personal anecdote, I find there's an interesting philosophical and poetic story that, we spend the first 9 months of our life after conception in a sort of salty medium. And I most certainly find myself seeking a salty medium of a different kind to go to the ocean and immerse myself in the sea as much as I can.
And why do you think that the integrated approach that you practice is not more common? Why is there often such a pushback from traditional medicine? I mean, it feels like this is the way to go, and this is where every doctor should jump in this, and it should be a part of every doctor's philosophy in a way. But it seems like, especially the traditional more specific doctors, they tend almost to push this away a little bit and say, okay, this is this new stuff and it's not proven, and we don't know if it really works. And
in large part, I think it's that it's still fairly new in the larger scheme of things. Medicine and medical science, or all the sciences, don't like rapid change. So I think it was Carl Sagan that said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so possibly what we're talking about is an integrative approach, particularly one that is guided by genetics, is not necessarily making, but we're saying that it's pretty extraordinary, that we are seeing results on a clinical level of anecdotes and experience. We're seeing some great results, and we need to collect that evidence, and it requires time. I think that in large part is the reason behind it. However, I mentioned before that I'm definitely seeing more welcome collaboration by super specialists and by allopathic doctors to this approach. If you look at postgraduate integrative healthcare training, there's a big need for it. There's a lot of people that are getting cross-skilled or upskilled in continuing professional development and interested in more integrative views and broader views in their practice.
Okay.
There's one other thing I was thinking about in terms of an answer for that. Pushback.
We can cut it, it's no problem.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of. Oh yes, a great example. So, by way of example, the number of people that are suffering from some form of cognitive decline or neurodegenerative condition, it's becoming more and more real. Huge numbers of people struggling with memory issues and brain health. And in the area of neurodegenerative disease, particularly Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, one of the clinicians in the US, Dale Bredesen, has had some incredible success with a broadly integrative approach. There have subsequently trials being done on up to 100 patients that have been published, which is amazing, and these results are really, really good. So the Bredesen protocol is something that I find very interesting. And the pushback, as you mentioned, comes from the way that science has been conducted, the method of science, and that is to say, well, if a patient has improved symptoms with a neurodegenerative condition, and you've applied 20 micro changes, which is the one that has had the causal effect? And Bredesen would have to then argue back, well, it's not a single one of these, it is the fact that we've integrated. So what it will probably do, and what I'm seeing it do, is ask the researchers for new methods of analysis. How do we ask the questions in the right way? How do we create and utilize the correct statistical method to do studies where there are integrative causal factors? And that's starting to happen as well. So the use of study designs, methodological design, like genome-wide association studies are very, very interesting. And not many of them have been done. I mean, in relative sense, but more of them are. So I think that will change. I think the pushback will change, and I think that we'll start being able to provide greater evidence for integrative protocols.
Okay.
I certainly hope so.
At Biolytica, we talk a lot about longevity and how to live a longer and healthier life. So how do you see yourself? What's your path to longevity? What are the things that you work on in your life? And what are the things that you try to improve to reach to a healthier life?
Personally.
Okay,
so it's my personal exploration and my intrigue in longevity and reading is definitely driven by an interest to see what is it in my life that what I have so far is what has come before. I have a history. You know, I've noticed things about myself, and I'd have to say that I've always been active. I've grew up moving a lot and involved myself in several sports, but as a child and adolescent and into early adulthood, I trained as a artistic gymnast, and it's a very intensive and detailed form of training. So I suppose I got great resolution and feedback from my body through being fortunate enough to train as a gymnast. So at 52 years old, I still play around on trampolines, and I'm upside down a lot and things.
Surf
like
every
that.
day, right?
Yeah, well, this surfing came next. I'm a lean guy, and I get cold quickly, but I also like to wear thinner wetsuits for more flexibility and range of motion. And I'm certain that thermal stress has played a role. And I've only really been able to see real evidence and literature on it in the last 5 to 10 years. So I think that plays a role. And then I love food, but I'd have to probably just say I was very fortunate and grateful to my mom, because my mother just always fed us in a healthy manner, and I most certainly love to pay attention to the quality in my food. I think that that's something that's often forgotten. we might not know everything. We know a lot, but we might not know everything about what you should eat and your macronutrient ratios and how much of this and how much of that and all the nutrients in them. But if you just begin by trying to make sure that everything you eat is the absolutely highest quality, that makes a huge difference, and it's often overlooked by dietitians, nutritionists, and people working in nutrigenomics. So I think that that's something that I've been pretty focused on for at least 20 years to ask questions about the source of this egg, and ask questions about the how this vegetable.
And I think that's exactly where we're at the right place, right? So
For sure.
one, yeah.
It's largely what drove the discussions between Angus and myself, and I've been very conscientious or conscious in my promoting of his food, of the animal products that he produces and some of the vegetables that the farm produces, because I've seen the story behind it. I've seen from soil to plate why it's better, and I just can't not tell people about that. There are many producers around the world that are starting to produce food with more consciousness and more attention, and I really think that's going to play a role in large populations of people's health.
Yeah. So James, thanks so much. It's been super interesting, and I think we could continue this conversation for hour. We probably will at another point.
Yeah, let's do it.
But yeah, we'll leave it at this point. And thanks for coming. Thanks for taking part, and thanks for taking such good care of us.
Thank you. My pleasure, Rob.
Hey, if you've enjoyed watching this episode as much as I have enjoyed recording it for you, then please leave a comment and let me know if you answered all of your questions and maybe even who I should talk to next. Make sure to also visit Longevity FM, where you'll find all our episodes, including show notes, full transcriptions, background info, links to websites and books of my guests, as well as commentary videos and other special content that's only available to our email subscribers. And please remember, it's your health, it's your life, so take control. Stay healthy, and I will see you in the next episode.